When Captain Moreno and his crew uncover Tortuga's legendary Vault of Shadows, they think they've found riches beyond their wildest dreams. But as they seize the treasure, they unleash a curse. Ghostly guardians, bound to protect the vault at all costs. With spirits haunting their every step, and the island itself turning against them, Raven faces a terrible choice. Abandon the treasure, or risk his crew's lives to escape with it. Will he make it out alive? And what price will they pay for defying the dead? The night was thick with salt and smoke, wrapping Tortuga in an uneasy silence as Captain Rafael, Raven Moreno, stepped ashore. Shadows clung to the dim alleyways of the infamous pirate island, but his eyes burned with purpose, piercing the darkness as he strode toward his destiny. For years, rumors of Tortuga's legendary vault had haunted him. The whispers of gold, and something darker, passed from sailor to sailor like a poisoned chalice. Tonight, he was ready to claim it, for this treasure wasn't just wealth. It was the key to power, the title of Pirate King, and the chance to uncover the fate of his father, the only man who'd ever come close to finding the Vault of Shadows. A ragged, half-burned map was clenched in Raven's hand, the only remnant left by his father, along with a single warning: gold bought with blood. But Raven's heart was hard, and he needed no reminding of the price one must pay for greatness. With the moon high and his mind set, he turned to his crew gathered at the docks, each one bound to him by gold, or secrets best kept. Some were loyal, others wanted his coin, and a few had debts darker than the night. Among them was Sylvia Silk Reyes, a cunning fighter with sharp eyes and a quiet step. Standing beside her, arms crossed, was Basher Koda, a hulking brute from the eastern seas, scars snaking across his arms from more battles than he could count. And lurking just beyond them was Zane Whisper Castro, a sly navigator who never spoke more than a word if he could help it, but saw everything. Each one had come here for a reason, and none were prepared for what awaited them. The air hung heavy with anticipation as Raven spoke, his voice a low growl cutting through the murmur of the waves. "Tonight, we seize the vault," he declared. "Wealth beyond measure, and the claim of Pirate King himself. If you want to see riches beyond dreams, follow me." His gaze lingered on each of them, challenging the doubts lurking in their eyes. But gold was a mighty lure, and tonight it gleamed brighter than caution. They moved silently across the island, skirting around patrols and the drunk and rowdy locals, making their way to the fort. Tortuga's ancient fortress loomed before them, a stone beast crouching on the cliffside, overlooking the restless sea. It had stood for centuries, surviving pirate raids and naval sieges, but none had ever found the secrets buried beneath it. Raven's heart pounded as they approached the first barrier, a rusted gate bound with chains and symbols carved into the metal, warning of curses older than Tortuga itself. Silk glanced at the symbols, her brow furrowing. "You sure about this, Captain?" she whispered, her voice low. "Some say those who touch this vault don't live to tell the tale." Raven flashed a grin, his eyes gleaming with reckless defiance. "Dead men tell no tales, and the dead don't own gold." With a nod to Basher, they pried open the gate, the chains clanking like a death knell as they slipped free. Inside, the smell of damp and something rotting filled the air, thick and oppressive. The walls were lined with ancient carvings of skeletal figures and unknown creatures, their eyes seeming to follow the crew as they descended into the dark belly of the fort. Each step down the winding stone staircase brought them closer to the core of the fort, the hidden chamber where the vault was said to lie. Raven could feel the weight of the place pressing on him, each breath coming harder, as if the air itself resisted their intrusion. Whispers seemed to drift from the shadows, faint and teasing, tugging at his resolve, but he ignored them, pressing forward with fierce determination. Their first obstacle was a chamber lined with statues, each one a grim-faced sentinel holding a different weapon. Raven paused, sensing a hidden danger in their unyielding stares. "Stay close," he ordered, noting the way Whisper's eyes darted over the statues, tense and wary. "Move too quickly, and we'll set off a trap that could end this journey before it begins." But fate had other plans. Basher, always impatient, stepped ahead, brushing against a statue's outstretched arm. A deep rumble echoed through the chamber, and suddenly the statues began to shift, grinding to life as their stony limbs swung to strike. The crew ducked and rolled, barely escaping the stone arms as they swung down, striking the ground with brutal force. Raven's heart thundered as he shouted, "Go! Move through!" They sprinted, dodging each statue's deadly reach, and tumbled into the next corridor, breathless and bruised but alive. The statues settled back into place, the sound of their grinding movements fading into silence, as if satisfied with their near miss. They pressed on, nerves stretched taut, the dark pressing in from all sides. The closer they got, the colder it became, the air filled with a faint metallic tang that made their skin crawl. Ahead lay the final chamber, and there, in the center, stood the Vault of Shadows. It was sealed with thick iron chains, symbols of ancient curses carved deep into its metal, warning of a forbidden power. But Raven felt nothing but raw, consuming ambition. With a fierce look, he took hold of the chains and pulled, feeling them snap free as if in invitation. The vault groaned open, revealing a hoard of gold and treasures, jewels glittering like trapped stars, silver gleaming in the pale light. Yet as they reached for the treasure, a voice filled the chamber, cold and hollow. "The vault is claimed, only by those who pay the price." A spectral mist began to seep from the walls, swirling around them, the faces of long-dead pirates taking shape, their hollow eyes filled with rage. Silk screamed, recoiling as one of the spirits reached for her, its fingers passing through her skin, chilling her to the bone. Raven's heart thundered, but his hands tightened around his prize, defiant even as the spirit circled. "Stand firm, crew," he roared. But as the first spirit lunged, clawing at one of his men with an unearthly wail, he realized that he'd unleashed something far more dangerous than he'd ever bargained for. The Vault of Shadows stood open, revealing riches that could crown Raven as the new Pirate King. But as he reached for the gleaming jewels and piles of gold, he could feel an unnatural cold pressing into his bones, seeping out from the vault like the breath of something long dead. Around him the crew murmured, their eyes caught by the treasure, their hands inching toward the piles of silver and jewels. But a warning lingered in the air, a whispered threat woven into the vault's very stones. Raven's fingers brushed against a golden chalice, and in that instant, the ground beneath them shifted. Shadows pooled and twisted around them, rising into the chilling shapes of ghostly figures. These were no mere apparitions. They were the tormented souls of pirates who had fallen prey to the vault's curse. Their hollow eyes glowed with rage, and they advanced slowly, with movements unnatural and stiff, like puppets bound to strings of malevolence. Silk was the first to back away, her eyes wide with terror as she recognized the twisted face of one specter, a pirate notorious across the Caribbean, believed dead for over a century. "Captain, these are the dead," she hissed, clutching her dagger, though it felt useless in her grip. "They've come to keep us from their treasure." But Raven had no intention of retreating. The ghostly figure of his father hovered before him, his face lined with a haunting sadness and anger. "Leave this place, son," the apparition murmured, its voice thick with regret. But Raven, driven by the ambition that had haunted him his entire life, only clenched his jaw. "I came here for what you couldn't take, old man," he spat. "This treasure is mine." Before they could process what was happening, one of the ghosts lunged forward, its hands passing through a crewman, who collapsed to his knees with a strangled gasp, his face pale and eyes wide in horror. The spirit had drained the very warmth from his bones, leaving him gasping on the ground. The rest of the crew froze, fear seizing their movements as the ghosts began to circle, eyes gleaming with rage and possession. In a desperate attempt to rally his crew, Raven shouted, "Steel yourselves. These ghosts can't harm what they cannot touch. Keep moving, grab what you can, and get out." His words were hollow comfort, and he knew it. But fear was a weakness that could kill them quicker than any blade or curse. They needed to press forward or risk losing everything. Basher, the towering brute, didn't hesitate. With a roar, he lunged forward, swinging his axe through the spectral forms. But the axe passed through them harmlessly, leaving Basher staggering and cursing. "Blast it, Captain! How are we supposed to fight what's already dead?" Raven clenched his fists, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. But before he could speak, Whisper, the navigator, stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "There's more to this vault than just gold," he muttered, glancing around. His sharp eyes landed on the carvings lining the walls, the strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint light. "These are markings of binding," he murmured. barely audible over the whispers of the dead. This isn't a vault for keeping treasure, it's a prison. A cold realization settled over them, and Raven's expression shifted from triumph to dread. This wasn't just the treasure of a pirate king. This was a trap designed to lure greedy souls to their doom, and they had walked right into it. The vault was cursed, and only by lifting that curse could they hope to escape with their lives. A sinister laugh echoed from the shadows, and a figure stepped forward, darker and more solid than the other spirits. He was draped in ancient pirate regalia, his face hidden beneath a weathered tricorn hat, his eyes burning with a hatred that had endured centuries. "So another fool seeks my throne," he sneered, his voice like a rusted blade dragged over stone. "You think you're the first to try and steal from the Vault of Shadows?" The crew recoiled, feeling the weight of the pirate's malice settle over them like a heavy fog. Raven met his gaze, defiant. "I am Rafael Moreno. This treasure will make me the Pirate King, not some forgotten wraith." The ghostly pirate tilted his head, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Then face my judgment, Moreno," he snarled, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "To take this treasure, you must pay the price. 1 life for every piece of gold." He raised a skeletal hand and the shadows surged forward, clawing at the crew with a relentless hunger. In that moment, panic erupted. The crew scattered, each man fighting to escape the clutches of the spirits. Silk slashed at the air, her dagger useless but her spirit defiant. "Raven, we're trapped," she shouted, dodging the grasp of a ghostly hand that nearly closed around her throat. Raven's mind raced. They had come too far, lost too much to abandon the treasure now. But Whisper's words echoed in his ears. A prison. This vault was bound by curses older than Tortuga itself. Perhaps the only way out was not through brute strength, but through the symbols themselves. "Whisper," Raven barked, catching the navigator's eye. "What do those symbols mean? How do we break the curse?" Whisper's gaze darted over the walls, his face twisted in concentration. "These symbols, they're bindings of blood and loyalty," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the howling spirits. "To break it, we'd need a bond stronger than the greed that brought us here. But I don't know if it's possible." Another crewman fell to his knees, his life draining as the specters fed on his fear. Raven gritted his teeth, fury and desperation flaring in his eyes. "We're pirates," he snapped, "but we didn't come here to die like dogs. Together we fight as one." Silk looked at him, her face pale but fierce. "Then lead us, Captain." A fire ignited in Raven's eyes, and he took her hand, nodding to Basher, Whisper, and the few remaining crew members. Together they gripped each other's arms, forming a circle as the spirits closed in. Raven's voice echoed through the chamber as he began to speak an ancient oath, a bond of loyalty that went beyond coin and treasure, something born of their shared desperation and defiance. The spirits paused, their hollow eyes narrowing as if sensing the shift in the air. The carvings along the walls began to glow, a faint light that grew brighter with each word of the oath. Raven's voice grew stronger, louder, his words laced with defiance. But the ghostly pirate, sensing his victory slipping, lunged forward, his form flickering with anger. "You think a few words will break centuries of chains?" he roared, his voice laced with bitterness. He reached for Raven, his cold hand brushing against the captain's arm, and Raven felt a searing pain as if his very soul were being ripped apart. Raven fought through the agony, clenching his jaw and finishing the last words of the oath. The light flared, filling the chamber with a brilliant glow that forced the spirits to recoil. The chains binding the vault groaned, rattling as if in protest. And then, with a final earth-shaking snap, they broke apart, freeing the crew from the curse's grasp. The spirits faded, their anguished wails receding into the shadows, leaving only the faintest trace of their presence. The ghostly pirate met Raven's gaze one last time, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes before he, too, vanished into the dark. Silence fell over the vault, broken only by the labored breaths of the crew. They stood amidst the treasure, battered but victorious, the riches finally theirs to claim. But the air was heavy, thick with the weight of what they'd unleashed. This gold had cost them dearly, and Raven knew that even in victory, there was a price yet to be paid. "We have it, Captain," Silk murmured, her voice tinged with a mixture of awe and horror as she looked at the wealth surrounding them. Raven nodded, his eyes hard. "Aye," he said, his voice hollow, "but let's take only what we need. Some things are better left behind." With grim resolve, the crew gathered their share, leaving the heart of the vault untouched. The crew's boots echoed through the darkened corridors as they made their way back toward the surface, their pockets weighed down with gold, yet a heavy silence had settled over them. They were battered, haunted by the horrors they'd left in the vault. Each step was fraught with tension, the air thick with something unspoken, a shadow lingering from the curse they had supposedly broken. But as they reached the entrance of the tunnel, an ominous tremor ran through the stone beneath their feet, shaking dust and pebbles loose from the ceiling. Whisper, ever vigilant, stopped dead, his eyes wide. "Captain, something's wrong." The ground shuddered violently, and the ancient chains they had broken in their descent suddenly snapped back to life, twisting and snaking up the walls as if animated by some dark force. Raven clenched his jaw, instinctively pulling his crew back. But before they could turn, the walls themselves began to shift, grinding together to seal them in. A cold wind howled down the tunnel, and from the darkness, that same spectral voice returned, mocking them. "You thought you'd leave so easily." The voice of the ghostly pirate king echoed, colder than the night sea. His form materialized before them, more solid and more menacing than before. The specter glared at Raven, eyes glowing with an unnatural fury, his tricorn casting a shadow that twisted like a clawed hand across the walls. "You've taken what is mine. Now you'll pay the true price." Panic surged through the crew, and Basher, fists clenched, yelled, "Enough of this, we've dealt with ghosts before, we can take him." He lunged, swinging his fist through the apparition, but his hand passed harmlessly through. The ghostly pirate grinned, his hollow eyes gleaming. "It isn't me you'll fight," the specter hissed, and with a flick of his wrist he summoned the spirits of the cursed crew who had fallen to the vault of shadows over centuries. They rose from the darkness, hollow-eyed and filled with vengeance, their bodies bearing the signs of their violent ends. Throats cut, limbs twisted, eyes wide with terror frozen in death. They closed in around Raven's crew, spectral weapons gleaming with a deadly light. Raven's heart hammered as he realized they were surrounded. The cursed souls swirled, each one a tortured fragment of the past, bound to the vault's twisted power. "We can't fight them. Not like this," he muttered, scanning the room for an escape. But every path was cut off, trapped by the spirit's ranks. Then Silk's voice broke through the chaos. "There's still a way," she said, her eyes narrowing as she held up the small, unassuming amulet she'd taken from the vault, a dull, rusted piece that had seemed worthless among the riches. It feels like it's connected to them somehow." Whisper's gaze sharpened. "It must be an anchor, something that binds them to the vault." Raven nodded, a desperate hope flickering in his chest. "Then we destroy it." But the ghostly pirate king's laughter filled the chamber again, louder, mocking their hope. "To break the curse is to sacrifice what you hold most dear. Are you willing to make that trade, Captain?" A tense silence fell. The crew shifted uneasily, casting wary glances at one another. They'd come here seeking treasure, power, the crown of the pirate king. Now they were asked to pay a price that none of them had anticipated. Raven's face hardened. He had fought too long, suffered too much to let a ghost stop him, but he also knew the cost of greed. His father's ghost, chained to the vault for eternity, haunted him still. With a resolute glance, he looked at his crew, each one battered yet loyal, despite the horrors they'd faced. "Take what you must, Captain," Whisper said quietly, a glint of understanding in his eyes. "We're with you." Raven took the amulet from Silk's hand, his fingers trembling as he raised it. The ghostly pirate king's eyes narrowed, his form pulsing with fury. "Then you forfeit everything," he snarled, and the spectral figures lunged, weapons flashing as they surged forward. With a defiant roar, Raven gripped the amulet and slammed it against the stone floor, shattering it in a burst of light that filled the cavern. A piercing scream tore through the air as the spirits recoiled, their forms twisting and writhing in agony, released from the curse that had bound them. But the light did not fade. Instead, it grew stronger, illuminating the chamber with an unearthly glow. The walls trembled, and a deep crack split the floor beneath them, the earth groaning as if in protest. Whisper staggered back, his eyes widening. "The vault! It's collapsing! Move!" Raven shouted, grabbing Silk by the arm and pushing her forward. The crew stumbled and ran, the ground shifting and buckling under their feet. Stone began to fall from the ceiling, crashing down as they dodged and scrambled toward the entrance. The path they'd come from now unrecognizable, twisted by the vault's collapse. Behind them, the ghostly pirate king gave one final anguished scream, his form dissolving into mist, the chains that had bound him crumbling to dust. He was gone, his curse lifted, but his fury lingered, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Just as they reached the last stretch of tunnel, a massive stone slab broke loose above them. Raven looked up, his heart sinking as he realized they wouldn't make it. He pushed the crew forward, shouting, "Go! Get out, now!" Silk, Whisper, and Basher dove through the opening, barely making it past the falling stone. Raven, a split second behind, threw himself forward just as the tunnel collapsed behind him, sealing the vault forever. They lay sprawled on the stone outside, gasping for breath, covered in dust and debris. Raven slowly sat up, his eyes scanning the wreckage, the realization sinking in that the vault was finally, irrevocably sealed. The crew was silent, the weight of their escape settling over them. They'd lost comrades, faced horrors beyond imagining, and the gold they carried suddenly felt heavier than before. It was the price they'd paid, the cost of defying the dead. Silk looked at Raven, her eyes hard but grateful. "We made it, Captain." Raven nodded, but there was no triumph in his gaze, only a quiet resolve. "Aye, but let's leave Tortuga, and leave the dead where they belong." The crew turned, limping back toward the shoreline, carrying with them only a handful of coins from the vault and a grim reminder of the treasure they'd unleashed, and barely escaped. The sea awaited, vast and unyielding, but as they boarded their ship, Raven knew they were changed. They were the living proof of Tortuga's curse, and they would carry its shadows with them for as long as they sailed. The vault, and its secrets, would remain buried beneath the island, its curse bound to Tortuga's depths, awaiting the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek it. The Stormcaller sailed out from Tortuga under a bruised sky, the jagged cliffs shrinking into shadows behind them. The sea was eerily calm, as if it sensed the silence of the crew, a silence not born from exhaustion, but from the weight of what they had survived. Each man kept to his task with grim resolve, their faces pale, eyes hollow, as if a part of them had been left behind in the cursed vault. Raven stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memories of his father's ghostly warning and the twisted grin of the Pirate King's specter. His hands gripped the wheel with a fierce resolve, the echoes of that haunted vault still lingering in his mind. They had come seeking treasure, power, but found only ruin and a taste of what lay beyond this world, a force older and more merciless than they had ever imagined. Beside him, Silk leaned against the railing, watching the darkening clouds drift across the sky. She hadn't spoken since they'd boarded, her face hard, eyes distant, fingers occasionally drifting to the dagger at her hip as if to ground herself in something real. Whisper kept to his charts, avoiding their eyes, his usual quiet demeanor now a shell that concealed the horror they'd endured. Even Basher, the ever-confident brute, seemed subdued, his hands flexing around the haft of his axe, as if reassuring himself that he was still flesh and blood. As night fell, Raven called them to the main deck, each one assembling slowly, reluctant yet drawn by the pull of their shared ordeal. The sea was a dark mirror beneath them, stretching out into an endless void, but the crew gathered close, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns. Raven cleared his throat, the words heavy on his tongue. "We went to Tortuga for wealth and glory," he began, his voice steady but laced with regret. "We found both, but at a cost none of us expected." His gaze swept over them, each face a reminder of the lives they had risked and nearly lost. "Captain, it was madness to go there," Silk spoke up, her voice firm yet filled with something deeper. "We barely escaped with our lives. That place, it should stay buried." Raven nodded, the weight of her words settling into his bones. "Aye, and it will." He turned to Whisper, who had remained silent, his eyes fixed on the deck. "The map," Whisper, "led us to the vault. It needs to disappear, along with every trace of what we found." Whisper looked up, his eyes haunted but resolute. Without a word, he pulled the crumpled, half-burned map from his satchel. the edges worn from years of use and faded with age. The sight of it brought back flashes of that dark, oppressive tunnel, the walls lined with the faces of the damned. He handed it to Raven, his expression a mixture of relief and finality. Taking the map, Raven held it up to the lantern's flame. For a moment he hesitated, the lure of the vault's treasure calling to him, whispering promises of power, wealth, a kingdom of his own. But then he saw his father's face, twisted in torment, and knew that some treasures were not meant to be claimed. With a swift motion he pressed the map to the flame, watching as it curled and blackened, the embers drifting out into the night like ash from a funeral pyre. The crew watched in silence as the last of the map disintegrated, the faint glow of the embers disappearing into the dark. When the final trace was gone, a strange stillness settled over them, as if a weight had lifted from their shoulders. But the silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken understanding that the vault would remain, waiting beneath Tortuga for the next soul foolish enough to seek it. Basher, ever the realist, broke the silence with a low growl. "So what now, Captain? We're rich, sure, but this curse..." He spat the word, his face twisted in disdain. "Will it follow us? Or is it buried with that vault?" Raven's jaw clenched, and he looked out over the restless sea, his expression hard. "That curse, Basher, lives in the memory of what we've seen. It'll haunt us, yes, but only if we let it." He paused, letting his words settle over the crew. "This gold, we earned it, and we'll spend it as free men. But the vault, and its secrets, let them stay buried. We sail on and we leave it behind." The crew nodded, each one steeling themselves, accepting the weight of their shared burden. They were changed, haunted, but they were alive. And for now, that was enough. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the waves, Raven called out, his voice carrying over the deck. "To new waters, men! Set the sails and chart us away from these cursed shores." The crew responded with a low cheer, their voices strained but resolute. With a final glance toward Tortuga, Raven turned the wheel, guiding the stormcaller into open waters, away from the shadow of that haunted island. Yet as they sailed, a strange wind began to blow, carrying with it a faint whisper that drifted through the rigging, a haunting echo of the vault's curse. Raven felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his gaze forward, his hand firm on the wheel. The crew too felt the ghostly chill, but none spoke of it, each one silently promising to keep the secrets of the Vault of Shadows with them, locked away in their minds like a treasure that no man should ever seek. In the days that followed, Raven found himself restless, the memory of his father's spirit etched into his thoughts, a lingering presence that haunted his dreams. He would often wake, the cold sweat of fear still clinging to his skin, and stare out over the ocean, wondering if the dead truly rested beneath Tortuga's cliffs, or if they had simply found another place to haunt. But Raven was a pirate, bound to the sea and its mysteries, and he knew that the past would always follow him, like the wake trailing behind his ship. With each day, he felt the vault's curse fade, replaced by the endless stretch of open waters and the promise of new horizons. He knew the world held treasures that were safer, adventures that were brighter, and he would seek them as he always had, ruthless, fearless, with the ocean as his only master. As the stormcaller sailed into the morning sun, the island of Tortuga disappeared from view, its cliffs swallowed by the mist. But the legend of the Vault of Shadows, and the crew who had escaped it, would endure, whispered by sailors and scribes alike, a tale of cursed gold, haunted vaults, and the price that only the brave, or the foolish, would dare to pay. If you enjoyed this tale of haunted treasure and narrow escapes, subscribe to You Pirate. Join us for more thrilling adventures across the seas, and don't forget to share this story with a friend who'd brave the waves. Who knows, maybe you'll join us for the next legend waiting just beyond the horizon.